Hi y'all, it's Angela and welcome back to a bit of a channel rebrand. So you may have noticed as you pull this video up that I've changed the name of my channel from Read Extra to Read the Sky, and that's purely an aesthetic change. I have just been feeling for a while that I've wanted to move away from the Read Extra name. It's just truly unnecessarily complicated. So just to kind of scratch that itch in my brain when I look at my own channel, I'm changing the channel name to Read the Sky. So just a little announcement, I thought we'd get that out of the way before we get into the true meat of this video, which is the 21 books that I read in the month of July. I got through a lot of books that were both on my NetGalley arcs as well as were on my 2022 anticipated list. So I'm really excited to share those with y'all and let you know what I think on some of these new releases that just came out. I've got these books ordered from my least favorite to most favorite, so I'm going to start with my 2 stars. I had two-star reads this month, and the first was Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. This is a well-known young adult fantasy about our main character Selena, who is a very skilled assassin. She is imprisoned by the king and then forced to participate in this tournament of champions to gain her freedom. I read this as kind of a Sarah J. Maas redemption after having read The House of Earth and Blood earlier this year and actually really enjoying it. So I decided to pick up her first or at least most well-known series, which is Throne of Glass, and I think that it's just not gonna cut it for me when you think of it in terms of fantasy. It has a lot of the really common 2010s 2000s YA tropes. Selena very much acts like a child even though she insists she isn't, and I'm pretty sure she's also suffering from Stockholm syndrome. Having read a few really good adult fantasy books in the past year, I think that Throne of Glass as a fantasy book just can't really compare to the genre. It's much more of a romance adventure mystery, and I think that YA part of it definitely tones the fantasy aspect of it down a lot. You do get the fun trope of a competition, of training, of a love triangle, all these very juicy tidbits that I think make for an interesting story, but not a great fantasy. So I ended up giving this book 2 stars, and I don't think I'll be continuing on in the series. The next book I read was one that I've never heard of before, and it's called The Fortress by S.A. Jones. This follows a man who, in order to save his marriage, decides to willingly enter into a matriarchal society for a year called The Fortress. I would definitely place this book in the speculative fiction category. It takes place in a world very similar to ours, but with this matriarchal society as kind of this forefront, as a very central part of this society. They know that a lot of usually convicts or men who get in trouble in normal society get put in this society to act as basically servants and slaves to the women that live there. I think this book's idea was very interesting. That's what caught my eye when I first picked it up at the library, but there's a lot of really messed up things that happen in this book. A lot of themes of sexual assault, questions of consent, like what is consent? There is none in this book. An example of a warning up front is that this man has an implied sexual encounter with a minor, and that is something that is seen as not terrible in the society, so do with that what you will. I was very highly uncomfortable throughout this, but at the end of the story, all that you learn is that this man still holds this really strong sense of self-entitlement, and even though he spent this whole year submitting to someone else, he comes away with it thinking that he's won because he's submitted himself sexually only, not in terms of respect or mutual understanding or anything like that. So it was kind of a pointless book in the end, to be quite honest. I gave this 2 stars. It was interesting concept, really weird execution. Now let's move on to the 3 stars. So the next book I read was The Woman in the Library by Sulari Gentil, and this is a book about 4 strangers who meet in a library. A woman gets murdered right next door, and they bond over the experience, all the while not knowing that one of them is the murderer. This is another book where I was suckered in by the synopsis. I love a good kind of strangers have to work together, they're bonded by unusual circumstances kind of story, but the execution of this was very strange in that it was kind of meta. This book is about an author writing a book about an author writing a book. And I think that double layer of plot was supposed to add intrigue because there were 2 separate mystery plots going on simultaneously. But what it really did was kind of muddle the tension because you would be strung up to this really high tension in the very innermost plot, and then it'd be broken by this dialogue that the author is having with this pen pal that she's sending her drafts to. So I think any attempt at the buildup of suspense was pretty much ruined just by the format itself. For being a mystery suspense, the plot development was also pretty weak. I feel like we do get a look into each of the characters, and maybe that was the point. The point was just to get to know the characters and get to know their relationships and how they build, but it was very wishy-washy. It didn't know what it was supposed to be, and I think that's why ultimately I had a very weird, lukewarm experience reading this book. The next book I read very recently, and it's called We Had to Remove This Post by Hannah Burvitz, and it's a short story about a group of workers who are content moderators and the kind of fallouts and stresses of their job. The point of this book is obviously to represent the real life horrors and stresses and fallouts of this type of job on actual people. And I think that it did a good job of kind of representing that. The author does a great job of showing how a group of very average people can slowly evolve over time and be deeply psychologically and physically affected by just watching and having to decide on terrible things. So I thought all of those points were really great in the short story and very punchy, effective. You immediately get the point. I didn't like the aimlessness of the story, and I do understand that it's a letter from one person about her experience during this particular time, so it can't really be as all-inclusive or have this really great narrative. But I think the ending kind of ruined the really great depictions earlier in the story about this line of work and how it affects the people who have to do it. The next book is Wild, From Lost to Found on the Pacific Crest Trail by Cheryl Strayed. And this is a memoir about the author's journey as a lone woman on the Pacific Crest Trail. So I have this kind of fascination with long distance hikers. There's a few people that I follow on TikTok who document their journey going on trails like the Pacific Crest Trail. And I just love seeing how they prepare, the difficulties they face, the experience of having to walk thousands of miles through all kinds of terrains and weather. So this book was right up my alley, and there was a lot of things that I liked about it. I liked the rawness and the unfiltered qualities of the author describing her experience. And then there were a few points that I wish that were hit on harder. One of those being that she was incredibly lucky because of a lot of the privileges that she's had. Everyone was kind of tripping over their hands and feet to help her. And one of her hiker buddies in the book actually even tells her he didn't get the same type of treatments that she got. So I think that lack of reflection makes this memoir a bit more superficial than it could have been. And I also did not love the fact that basically every guy in this book was either seen in a sexual way or saw her in a sexual way. I feel like that is just strange to me. I don't know, maybe it's an artistic choice, but I gave it 3 stars. I definitely love the topic, but it definitely came off as a bit of a superficial memoir at points. The next book is The Pisces by Melissa Broder, and it's definitely a weird one. It follows a woman who broke up with her long-term boyfriend and is kind of in crisis mode, so she goes to a beach house to take a break from reality, and that's where she meets and falls in love with a merman. This is one of those books that's definitely been in my peripheral. It's touted as one of those really weird, out there books for those that have kind of eccentric tastes in reading, and so I've always been really curious just to see what it was about. And I definitely agree that it's weird, but not just weird, it's also graphic and also just a lot. It's very intense in every way possible, mostly sexual. There was a lot of sex in this book, but none of it was sexy, and I think that was the weirdest part of reading this. Very graphically descriptive, just it made everything very gross and technical and just maybe cringy is the best word for it. But at the heart of it, it's a classic siren story with a twist using the context of modern relationships, and it's definitely applicable and captures a lot of the dating styles of this decade in very specific details, almost too many details. Have I mentioned that there's just a lot of really gross details in this book? So if that doesn't make it abundantly clear, please check the trigger warnings for this book. There's a lot, and there's a few that you probably won't expect. I gave this book a 3 stars because while the themes of self-love and self-discovery were really well shaped throughout this book, especially the highs and lows, I thought were really well crafted, the crudeness and just the visceralness of everything in this book did not make this a pleasant reading or listening experience. In my case, I had to listen to this on audio, and I'm just gonna say I don't recommend it. The next book was one I was really excited to read, and it's The Book of Accidents by Chuck Wendig. This follows a family, Nate, Maddie, and Oliver, who inherit Nate's father's house, and very strange things keep happening to them. So before going to this, I definitely thought it was a more straightforward horror book, but it's actually got this very fantastical element at the heart of it, and honestly even a little bit science fiction-y if you're into things like timelines, time loops, multiple universes, infinite universes. Very unexpectedly mix of horror, fantasy, sci-fi elements all throughout this, and I thought that made for a really fresh take on the family moves into a house and strange things happen to them trope. So I definitely enjoyed that, but it's not really a haunted house story, so I want to kind of nip that in the bud before we get going here. With the multiple POVs, I think the suspense element or the scary element is taken out, but you do get to know each character really well, and so that emotional element of family and sticking together through thick and thin is really strong throughout this book. There were a few fantastical elements specifically involving Maddie and Oliver that I wish were expanded upon just a little bit more. It seems like they were kind of thrown in there and then we just accepted as reality, even though they were probably the most interesting parts of the book. They definitely were rushed, especially near the end, trying to tie all of it together. So that was one thing that I didn't love especially. So 3 stars if you're interested in the more fantasy sci-fi elements, would definitely recommend this one. The next book I read, a very anticipated mystery suspense, and it was The House Across the Lake by Riley Sager. This follows Casey, a disgraced actress who escapes to her remote lake house where new neighbors have moved in, and she sees very suspicious things happening with the couple across the lake, and she's convinced that the husband has plans to murder the wife. I don't know what it is about this trope, but this trope must have the movie world, publishing world, TV show, Hollywood world in a chokehold, because I have seen at least 5 different types of entertainment's plots centered around this concept of I spy something across the way that doesn't seem right, but everyone else thinks I'm crazy kind of plot. And I loved it in the beginning, but now I'm definitely struggling to see the newness and the originality of all these new takes on this plot. And that seems like the motivation that Riley Sager took behind crafting this version of this trope. He was really gunning for originality, that's for sure. There were a ton of twists in this book. Did I love them all? No, I did not. I think that it was just too much and too little. None of it made sense. And the moment that sank in was when I was trying to retell the plot of the story, and every time I had to be like, but wait, there's more. If you try to condense everything that happened in this book to the bare bones and just tell it straight as it is, it just sounds so ridiculous. Like in the moment, it feels like, oh yeah, like this could work. It's really exciting. There's so many things that you can't see coming. But then when you think about it, it feels almost comical how many twists that kind of appear that come out of nowhere. Definitely not a Riley Sager that I liked. I think I am 1-2 now for books that I've liked versus disliked from Riley Sager, and I'm not really sure that I want to check out his newer releases. I don't know, somebody convinced me. Let me know your favorite Riley Sager book if you have one that is really, really worth reading, because right now I'm stuck. I don't really know if I want to stay on this boat, just like the characters from the book. And now we're moving on to the 4 stars. So the next book I read was Patricia Wants to Cuddle by Samantha Allen. This book follows the last 4 contestants on a bachelor-style dating show, and they go film in this very remote island where spooky things happen. This book is a combination of so many things that don't seem like they would gel well together, but they somehow do. So it's a horror Bigfoot retelling, but it's also a satire about reality TV and about the people who go and participate in reality TV. It has queer/lesbian undertones. It's set in a really remote, spooky island, so it's got that really atmospheric ambiance, and it was just kind of a really fun time. I especially love books that explore the behind the scenes of reality TV, especially Bachelor or Bachelorette style reality TV, and I love getting the heads of contestants as well as the producers who make stuff happen. The main character Renee does have kind of a I'm not like the other girls attitude, and that was a little bit unpleasant to constantly read from her point of view about. And there were also a few things that happened to characters or about characters that I don't really think I would agree with, just on a is it realistic level. Just know that things happen fast and there'll definitely be twists. Also, if you enjoy slasher style horror, you might really like this. The way that the contestants are kind of picked off is very reminiscent of that genre, and it has the suspense without too much of the horror. It's gory, but not really scary. I think it's a really good combination of that kind of fine line between suspense and horror. The next book I read was Hide by Kirsten White, and this follows 14 contestants who enter into a week-long hide-and-seek competition set in an abandoned amusement park. I feel like on BookTube I've seen a lot of very strong differences in opinions on this book. A lot of people saying that it was one of their least favorite books, definitely a 1 or 2 stars, and then very few saying that it was great. I'm going to come out and say that I finished this book in one night, so that might tell you something about if I liked it or not. I definitely thought that it was very engaging. I really love the concept, and even though the pacing could be quite slow sometimes, I always wanted to know what came next. I was always curious for what was going to happen to the next person. What was the true meaning behind this competition? Who were the people running it, and why were they running it? So the story did a really good job of bringing up all these questions that the reader would want to have answered and capturing their attention through that. So the story and competition was supposed to be a commentary on the economic class, this concept of wealth begets wealth, privileges that people take advantage of but never acknowledge. Quite frankly, I don't think that was the strongest part of the book. I stuck around because I wanted to work out all the mysteries and the tangles of what this competition was about, not because I was so interested in the author's take on rich people get richer. Also, there were journal entries that were my absolute least favorite part in this book. They definitely need to be taken out. I skimmed through almost all of it. They didn't add any. But I still had an amazing time staying up till 2 a.m. reading this book, so for that I have to give it 4 stars. The next book was definitely an anticipated book of 2022, and it was the book of Cold Cases by Simone St. James. This follows the main character Shay, who runs an amateur investigative blog about cold cases, and she gets a chance to interview Beth Greer, who is this socialite that was accused of murder but got away with it at the trial. Again, the author comes through with this excellent blend of true crime and supernatural. I was hooked from the beginning. I didn't want to put this down for the entire day. I couldn't stop until I finished it. But I will say that it is kind of a predictable book. It wasn't that there were so many amazing twists that you wouldn't have seen coming, and that's what makes this book great. I think it's the combination of the atmosphere, the genuinely spooky and haunting vibes of Beth Greer's house where these interviews take place, as well as the dual POVs of past and present, where you can have all these puzzle pieces and slowly fit them together, get a really good big picture. That being said, since it jumps around in the past and present a lot with a lot of different POVs, you get kind of repetitive information. So if that's something that you know you don't like, I might skip this one. It does that a lot, and honestly throughout most of her books that's a pretty common theme of you getting the same information from different points of views. The next book I read was For Your Own Good by Samantha Downing. This book follows a series of murders and unfortunate events that happen at a very elite prep school. I love the style that Samantha Downing uses to craft her scary, kind of morally gray protagonists, and it's definitely no different in this book. Teddy is one of the teachers at the school, and he's the person that we meet in the synopsis and at the beginning of the book. He's definitely an interesting guy with an interesting set of ethics and reasonings and outlooks on teaching and his students. So I think that is a take that you don't really get from teachers a lot. But what I also wasn't expecting were the multiple POVs from the students and other teachers in this book. That definitely gives a lot of extra lenses to view this school and the students and the faculty from. Overall, this was a really fun escapist novel, and if you love rich people drama, I definitely recommend this book. The next book I read was Bona by Tessa Moshfegh, and I wasn't expecting to talk about this book here. That might be surprising because I do talk about one of Tessa Moshfegh's books, My Year of Rest and Relaxation, quite frequently on this channel as a book that just really stuck out to me when I first read it. But this book, I wasn't expecting to want to investigate further because it was a historical fiction. Me and historical fiction are truly frenemies. As a whole, I do not like the genre, but there's just a few good eggs in there, and then there's some times where I think, you know what? I love you, historical fiction. I think I'm going to be a historical fiction girly. And then bam, another World War II fiction hits the shelves, and I'm done. I'm out. This book rotates its focus among the people in a small village named Bona, and it also centers on this little boy named Marek, who is the son of the village shepherd. And that's about it for the plot, really. This book doesn't have a very strong plot. It's more of a character study. Things happen, obviously, but the main thing isn't how they happen, why they happen, but more how the people were affected by these things happening. I know that doesn't really make sense, but I think that that is the style that she kind of writes in. So it's kind of a retrospective and introspective book in that sense. And I think that that's why I liked it more than I was expecting to. It's definitely a bit satirical. You get kind of a few eye-raise moments when you read through the characters' thoughts. There's not really good people in this book. They're just people, and they do things, and it's somehow really interesting. The next book I read was One to Watch by Kate Stayman London, and this follows our plus-size main character who, after giving really scathing critiques to a bachelorette-style dating show, gets recruited to be the next bachelorette on the show. This book was so addicting. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, I've been really into reading books about the behind the scenes of reality TV, especially bachelorette-style reality TV shows. So this book was, it just hit all the things that I love in a good romance book. I like the structure of the book. It's set up so that each chapter is an episode that happens in the show, and so you get to see the progression that the main character has with each of the male contestants on the show and with herself, very incrementally. It's a very smooth progression from the start, where she's definitely very anxious about her place in the show and her reception that she would have with the wider audience of reality TV, and then the growth and reflection at the end, where she comes to terms with the crazy journey that she's had and how it has both contributed good and bad to her life and how she's going to move forward from it. I can't speak on this personally, but I feel like this book wouldn't be a pleasant experience to read if you are plus size. If you're looking for that plus size rep from a main character, I just don't think this is it. The main character, not only is she very anxious and quite pessimistic and also very down on herself through the majority of this book, a lot of really crappy things happen to her, like unnecessarily crappy things happen to her. And so I think that if you're trying to relate to the main character and find yourself within her representation in the book, it just doesn't feel great, honestly. It's a really fun time, but not necessarily the great plus size rep that I think it was trying to be. The next book I read was Rage of Dragons by Evan Winters, and this follows Tao, who sets out on a revenge plot to become the best swordsman in the land after losing those closest to him. This is definitely an action-packed, violent, compelling, very gripping fantasy. I think this is the start in the trilogy. I definitely love this as a fantasy. The first 100 pages were quite slow though. It took a bit of convincing for me to continue on, but after you get started on Tao's revenge plot, everything from there forward just keeps rolling. It's an amazing action-packed book with a really interesting, kind of stubborn, maybe unlikable main character. He's very set in his ways, and I love a main character in a fantasy that's a bit morally ambiguous at times. I think that makes adult fantasies a bit different from, for example, young adult fantasies, where the main character is definitely very human in their decisions, and they make good decisions and they also make bad ones, and you're just on the sidelines watching how their small action can sometimes determine the bigger plot points of this usually war that they're fighting in. And I've loved seeing that play out. This was definitely a really interesting fantasy that I wasn't expecting to love so much, and I'm excited to read the next one in the series. Now we're moving on to the gems of the month, the 5 stars, the ones that I can't stop thinking about. Even after finishing them, they were just so good. And one of those is Near the Bone by Christina Henry. This book follows Maddie and William, who live in an isolated cabin in the mountains. And one day, Maddie goes out and finds that they aren't as alone as they seem to be. This book, oh my gosh, this book, so intense, so gripping, so compelling right from the first page. This entire book happens within the span of less than a week. That's how quick everything happens. There is no fussing around, no extra unnecessary details. Everything is bam, bam, bam. You are on the edge of your seat. You have to know what happens next. And just the way that the author is able to slip in really great details and little flashbacks of the past without bogging down everything that happens in the present is just chef's kiss. So great. If you love supernatural horror, if you love an isolated snowy cabin, if you love the concept of things that go scratching in during the night, if you love monsters that you can't see, the thrill of something out there hunting the main characters, this is it. All in here, all in Near the Bone. This is everything that you will love in a thriller, horror, suspense is located conveniently in one amazing little book. Please read this. It's probably going to be one of my favorites from this year. I had such a great time reading it. The next book I read was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, and this is a book following Sam and Sadie, who become friends over a shared love of video games when they're children, and then as adults they become partners who start a video game company together. This book is such an emotional story, and I think it really tries to capture the essence of human nature and the human experience. It's tragic, it's beautiful, it's funny, it's sad, heartbreaking. It has so many really great elements of what it is to just live and be human and love your family and have people disappoint you, but then also create great things together. I also like that it covers something that's not really seen often in literary fiction, which is video games and the amount of effort and crafting that goes into creating a really great story behind a video game and the technicalities that make the gameplay experience so immersive and interactive. This book, before getting into it, seemed very light and happy and emotional, but more on the positive side. But there are quite a few trigger warnings and very tough events that happen in this book that I would check trigger warnings for. It is definitely not an easy book to get through. Very emotional, but very great and definitely very memorable. The next book was also a pretty emotional one, and it was Chaodas Second Act by Sopan Deb. And this follows a Bengali family that recently lost their daughter Kea in a tragic car accident months after she came out as a lesbian, and they did not take it well. So the family has a lot of regrets, and in the aftermath of this tragedy, they find that Kea has written this play before she died, and they decide that they want to stage the play to honor her memory posthumously. We don't just follow the people in this family who are most emotionally tied to Kea and Kea's life and have this immense guilt tied to her death, but we have the story that's adjacent to the family, and it presents a different type of South Asian family, one where there's a lot less love, a lot less support and emotion and togetherness of community that really contrasts the main Das family. This book was also especially emotional, very heartfelt, a lot about the growth of people after a tragedy and how people slowly move on but still honor the memory of the people that were in their lives. The next book I read was Notes on an Execution by Danya Kukafka, and this follows a serial killer and the women who he encountered in his life. Though it follows the present point of view of the serial killer who is about to be executed, is really about the women that were in his life that affected him, were affected by him, came into contact with him, and their lives because of it. I really liked the juxtaposition in this book because one of the things that the serial killer kind of harps on is this idea of alternate realities. And in another world, if I had different circumstances, I wouldn't be doing this. Or what would happen to me in a different world? I wouldn't be executed in a different world. But then it's also juxtaposed with this point of view of, well, all these women who were victims of the serial killer could have also had a different life. They could have lived on for several decades afterwards, had a really fulfilling life of their own that were cut short by this one man's decision. So I think that kind of comparison between these two made a really, really strong point. That is a really different take on the traditional serial killer narrative that I feel like true crime has brought about in the recent decade. I loved this take on it. It's much more sympathetic to the actual victims with a little bit less focus on the motivations of the serial killer. This book makes you think a lot too, especially about the death penalty. It takes a bit of a neutral perspective on it in just its presentation. It doesn't tell you to think one way or another. And I think it opens up the door for a lot of really good discussion on the legitimacy and necessity of the death penalty as a punishment, as the ultimate form of punishment that the state can give. The next book I read was The Flat Chair by Beth O'Leary, and this follows Tiffy and Leon, who are kind of non-traditional roommates. Tiffy gets the apartment from the evenings to the mornings and then the weekend, while Leon gets the apartment throughout the days. These two never met before becoming roommates, and their paths have never crossed because of their schedule. But slowly, through no communication and through little remarks and jokes, they build this really sweet relationship and this very sweet romance. First thing that's pretty commendable is that the author puts in a lot of effort in making these two POVs very distinct from each other. Both characters have very distinct voices in this book, and I think that adds to fully fleshing out the perceptions of these two characters and their personalities. I thought I was getting myself into a really sweet, lighthearted, oddball roommate situation, but what we ended up with was a really intense, abusive ex situation with a incarceration story on the side. And so there was a lot going on that made this more than just a romance story. And I think the way that relationship was built was really great, really steady, really beautiful. I know that this story definitely is a bit of a clickbait in the sense that it's not what you expect it to be, but I think in the end, it's better than what it could have been. It's not so superficial and lighthearted. There is definitely a point to these two people coming together more than just their odd rooming situation. And the last book of my gigantic wrap-up is one of my favorite romances from this year. It's Bet on It by Jodie Slaughter. This book follows Aja, who recently moved to a small town to escape her busy city life and decided to join the local weekly bingo nights. And it's there that she meets Walker, who recently just came back to take care of his grandmother. So imagine me, I'm scrolling through NetGalley, minding my own business, and I see this really cute romance cover, and I think, I can check out the synopsis, and it's beautiful, it's pastel, and then I see the 3 words, Bingo Sex Pact. And honestly, that just made me want to read the book more. Not gonna lie. I have never, ever, and I don't think I will ever in my life, ever see those 3 words in one sentence ever again. Surprisingly, this book is probably going to be my favorite romance of the year. This book is so much more than just the bingo sex pack, so don't let that scare you away. It's really one of the best, most organic development and most emotional development of relationship I've ever seen. And one thing that really stood out to me is the way that these two characters are first introduced to each other. Because one thing that I don't always love is that a lot of romances start with lust and then don't put enough emphasis on the emotional development, whereas Aja and Walker meet at this very vulnerable moment where Aja's having a public panic attack and she doesn't know what to do, and she's literally frozen in her spot. But then Walker comes up and offers this very tender moment of kindness to a stranger that he doesn't even know. And in that moment, you build such a strong foundation for these two characters to start this very realistic romance based on support and love and kindness and caring and compassion. It's so sweet. One thing that I also liked is that Aja and Walker get very equal distributions of development with their personal plots. A lot of the times with dual POVs, you get one person who has a really complex, well thought out backstory with really well thought out motivations, and you get their love interest who is kind of like half-hearted, thought out plot. they had their conflicts resolved really quickly and easily and without a lot of problems, and it kind of makes for a boring, unbalanced relationship. But these two, they both have a lot of things from their past and their current self that they work actively towards to overcome and get better from, and they also work together to build their relationship and build a really strong family and connection in this small town. So it's a great small town romance, and it's a very emotional and sweet one at that. I would definitely recommend it. And those were the 21 books that I read in the month of July. Phew, finally done with that. Hopefully August also is a really great reading month, and I'm really looking forward to sharing my wrap up for those books with y'all in a month. If you want to find me on other places on the internet, I have my Instagram and Goodreads linked in the description, and I would love to be friends with you on there as well. Let me know some of your favorite and least favorite books from the month in the comments. I would love to hear them, and I'll talk to y'all next time.